How do psychedelics facilitate emotional and psychological healing?
These are sentient plant or fungi beings that we can interact with. One thing we understand from all of those is that set and setting, the environment, the approach that you take, the intention that you set, and the setting in which you partake of these things are probably the biggest factor in the kinds of outcomes that you can get.
Addiction recovery is something that's incredibly important. It's something that's coming up again and again and again when it comes to psychedelics.
Certainly there's lots of anecdotal testimonies of people who report powerful experiences under the influence of various kinds of psychedelics.
What do you think the biggest misconceptions are that people might have that would prevent them from trying?
Well, I think again,
From what I've heard, most people I know who have done it have had very positive experience afterwards.
How does this state of mind contribute to personal and collective transformation? Welcome to the Rich Life Recipe, where we explore the essential ingredients for living a truly fulfilling life through health, wealth, and wisdom. Today's guest is Dr. Kenneth Tupper, a pioneering researcher, educator, and thought leader in the field of psychedelic studies. Since 1999, Dr. Tupper has dedicated his career to uncovering how psychedelic plants and substances can foster innovative thinking, evoke wonder, heal trauma, and even address pressing social challenges. Dr. Tupper holds an impressive academic pedigree with a PhD in education studies from the University of British Columbia, where he is currently, if memory serves, an adjunct professor at the School of Population and Public Health. Some of these words, by the way, I will butcher. I'm going to pre-warn everyone listening and watching. He's also a member of the Clinical and Scientific Advisory Board for MAPS Canada and serves on the advisory board of the Ayahuasca Research Center in Brazil. His research has been featured in top academic journals, global media outlets like The Economist and NBC News, and conferences around the world. I've actually tried to read a few of these papers, which are available on his website. Beyond his academic achievements, Dr. Tupper has spent nearly 2 decades, that's 20 years for those that don't know what decade means, which means you're probably American, in public health policy, creating harm reduction strategies, and advocating for innovative approaches to drug education. He's an artist, a musician. He's a passionate advocate for using psychedelics as tools for personal and societal transformation. In this episode, I'm hoping that Alicia and I can dive into how psychedelics can contribute to health, to the economic and ecological impact, and perhaps unlock the wisdom for individuals and communities listening to this podcast. Get ready for a fascinating conversation that just might challenge everything you think you know about these misunderstood substances. Welcome, Dr. Ken Tupper.
Thank you.
We're so excited to have you. I don't want to waste 1 second because I'm ready to go. I have so many questions. So I am a health junkie, and since one of our pillars is health, I am so just fascinated by this psychedelic world of just this broad spectrum of what you've been able to collect in knowledge. So for someone like myself who hasn't actually gone down that road yet, but who is wanting to experiment with psychedelics, I've heard so much about microdosing, and many of my friends have done ayahuasca and have taken that journey. What would you say to the novice who's interested in getting started, but doesn't, maybe wants to take it slow? What's the first approach?
Good question. I think the first thing I would recommend is do your homework. Research carefully what your options would be for understanding the potential benefits and the potential risks. These are really powerful tools used for millennia in traditional indigenous cultures, and only sort of re-entering contemporary modern culture in the past, 100 years, but really the second renaissance just coming online in the last couple of decades. And being aware that as these are powerful tools, there's reasons for people to think carefully about whether it's right for them, how the context in which they might be able to maximize benefits and minimize risks.
Can I ask, like, how do psychedelics like ayahuasca, psilocybin, MDMA facilitate emotional and psychological healing? And can you share a transformative story from your own research or experience?
Sure. Well, I think there's different levels of explanation that can be applied to understanding the way these work. So there's, again, traditional indigenous understandings of these are sentient plant or fungi beings that we can interact with. There's, again, in modern Western culture, a sort of psychological or neurophysiological explanation, and lots of research going on in those areas. So I think one thing we understand from all of those is that set and setting, the environment, the approach that you take, the intention that you set, and the setting in which you partake of these things are probably the biggest factor in the kinds of outcomes that you can get. And those insights are, they're somewhat unpredictable in terms of sometimes you don't know what might come up. And that's why, again, having someone, a guide or a shaman or some kind of ceremonial leader, therapist is often the way to, again, help mitigate anything that comes up that might be challenging. But the potential insights that people report and have been documented now increasingly include sort of many levels of one's sort of being, sort of spiritual, psychological, physiological. People can have insights about the way that they eat or the way that they consume other substances, overcoming challenging relationships with those that we call addictions, for example. Insights about their mental well-being, about their sort of habits or practices, and consider how those impact their day-to-day life, and consider making changes in those. And relationships with others, family members, friends, sort of reconsidering the ways that one interacts with people in your life, and how you can, again, maximize the kinds of benefits that you can achieve through all of those different domains.
Do you have a story of your own transformative, or someone that you know or you've seen yourself?
You read my mind.
One of my personal experiences was insights with ayahuasca about my relationship with sugar. My father died from complications of type 2 diabetes, and I had a couple of really profound experiences, not directly related to that, but about my cravings for sugar. And all of this, it wasn't a big flash of insight, but it kind of allowed me to process my relationship with sugar from childhood, which I now recognize was essentially an addiction. And the main insight that I took away was that if I didn't change the way that I consumed sugar, it was probably going to kill me in the same way that it killed my father. So it caused me to really cut back to a point of elimination, and then after several years sort of reintroduced in small amounts, but completely different from the sort of impulsive, compulsive ways of ingesting sugar that I sort of assumed was natural and normal. And since then, I've done a lot more learning and research about the way that sugar affects our metabolism, and so much of our metabolic health concerns are probably related to dietary sugar.
So apologies, Alicia, but just to dive onto that, because I think sugar is probably something that majority of our listeners and those watching the unedited version on YouTube will find. How so? How does how does the medicine, which I believe is the correct terminology, how does the medicine show you that sugar could potentially be this trigger or this beast or this thing sitting on your back that has shaped so much of your life?
Well, for me, it was actually having a sort of hypoglycemic incident in the middle of an ayahuasca ceremony that made me
Wow.
go into panic mode, thinking I was, going to go into hypoglycemic coma, or like all these kind of essentially probably delusions in the moment. I don't think it was probably true, but it made me. I was sort of panicking and thinking that I needed to get some sugar into my body. I was going to go into some hypoglycemic shock, and
Wow.
it kind of worked through. None of that happened, but it made me kind of have this major wake up call. It made me to realize that the way that sugar, and made me start, not in that moment, but subsequently do some research and learning about the way that sugar impacts our dopamine reward receptors, and creates habitual patterns of consumption. One of the insights later was sugar is a white powder that we've extracted from plants that in its natural forms maybe isn't so harmful, but in the concentrated white powder version that is sort of widespread in our food systems, can cause serious harms both to individuals and collectively, probably. And I know there's lots of policy work going on in terms of looking at sugary sodas, and there's amounts of sugar that are pervasive in our food systems that would have major impacts on public health if we could realize changes in that direction. But for me, it was a personal thing, and didn't want to kind of impose my beliefs on others. I just kind of slowly cut back and then cut out sugar largely from my diet in a drastic way.
So now, do you think that came up for you during your ayahuasca because it's in your subconscious? Or so where does it, I feel like people I've spoken to that have done it have said it was something very deep embedded in them. They knew was there, but they didn't know was there, or they never addressed it, let's say. Do you think those are the things that will come up for someone?
I think it varies. It's very unpredictable.
So it's unpredictable.
Yeah, exactly. There's, for everybody, it's going to be different. In fact, even for oneself, if you do, subsequent ceremonies or experiences, each one is going to be different. You can't anticipate necessarily or direct where it's going to go. For me, that insight was definitely latent. It wasn't something I was thinking about. I wasn't intending to go there. It was
never, right.
It just came up, and now in retrospect, I'm very glad that it did, even though it was a really hard, sort of challenging experience in the moment. It was, as I mentioned, it was almost a bit of a panic attack, and feeling very physically discombobulated and psychologically discombobulated in ways that was insightful, but stressful. But then subsequently, that was short-lived, or at least I was able to kind of have. It was in a ceremonial context. There were others around, and it didn't result in anything sort of disruptive in the long run. But
it wasn't harmful to you.
Yeah, it was kind of a personal.
Was not harmful. Yeah.
Sort of personal small t trauma in the moment that had major sort of ripple effects in terms of the way that I thought about, say, my relationship to sugar and sort of diabetic tendencies, I guess, genetically, those kinds of things.
So cool.
It's incredible. Sorry, Alicia, I was about to speak.
Go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned a white powder, and that led my brain to think of a certain other white powder, and realizing how tired I am and how useful that would be. But telling me that addiction recovery is something that's incredibly important, and something that's coming up again and again and again when it comes to psychedelics, and how they potentially could be an effective tool for addressing addiction and eating disorders. Even, funny enough, you mentioned sugars and how that has been something that perhaps the dopamine receptors in your brain. Are there particular substances or protocols that stand out to you in this regard, in the regard of addiction recovery?
Well, it's one of the interesting and exciting areas of psychedelic research right now. There's a number of clinical trials going on looking at various psychedelic substances, to be used as adjuncts for psychotherapy and treating addiction. And so I won't speak to, I'm not involved in those clinical trials directly. I think we want to wait and see, but certainly there's lots of anecdotal testimonies of people who report powerful experiences under the influence of various kinds of psychedelics that have caused them to sort of reconsider the way that they consume different substances, from, as I mentioned, sugar or tobacco or alcohol or other types of drugs. Caffeine. There's lots of people who report different sort of insights about the ways that we consume things, and or even sort of behavioral patterns in our body. I was involved in one study on, it was qualitative research on ayahuasca and eating disorders. And that was really interesting. It wasn't a clinical trial. It wasn't an intervention. It was interviews with people, mostly women, who had experiences drinking ayahuasca and had a diagnosis of an eating disorder, and to hear about some of the testimony, the reports that they gave about insights for themselves and their relationship with food. It was fascinating. So that's, again, leading to now more higher quality scientific studies in that domain as well.
Incredible.
So it's showing promise in those areas.
I mean, yeah, the area of psychedelic studies is showing promise in a lot of areas.
Yeah.
Addictions treatment is certainly one of them.
There's a question of it's my question, by the way. I don't know if it's a question as in the general public, and I may have made it sound there that there was like a general consensus. But something I think about a lot is, I know a lot of people, majoritively white people, going into native areas to do these things and then having these incredible experiences. And I wonder about the integration, right? You've had the psychedelic experience in this space, directed by a shaman. What are the best practices for integrating these insights, like you've mentioned yourself, into your daily life for sort of long-term health benefits, if you know of any in your research, in your time in the space?
Again, I think this whole field is so kind of new in terms of rigorous scientific studies, and just the sort of social phenomenon only the last few decades that it's really kind of come out. And so I think we're still learning what best practices are. I think there's a general consensus that integration is crucial and really important for people to not just have insights in the moment, but to be able to make those insights into longer term transformations and sustain whatever came up for them in a way that helps bring those into a kind of shift in their consciousness long term, not just momentarily, for general health and wellness. And that's, again, there's lots of people in the area of psychology, psychiatry, who are keen to see more work done in this area, and continue to define those best practices through ongoing research and clinical work.
I love that it's so new. I think, and it's not really new, but to determine these practices, in a sense, it is new, which is what I think I love most about it. And I'm so intrigued, and I really do want to do it. And I think getting to whatever it is for you that comes up and making those long-term changes, because if you don't know what's hindering you, then you can't really fix it. And sometimes you can go through years of therapy, you can try all of these things, and you're still not getting to the root of what it is. And I think sometimes we don't, until we really just kind of let go of all of that and transport ourselves somewhere else where we're actually not capable of thinking. I think you have to have that, where your mind is so relaxed that it can take you somewhere where maybe you're afraid to go. And our mind is designed to protect us. So essentially, when you're awake or conscious, it doesn't let you go to those places. So I think that's what has me the most intrigued. And I'm wondering if, during your long career in both research, education, what do you think the biggest misconceptions are that people might have that would prevent them from trying?
Well, I think of, again, my parents, both of whom have passed away now, and their sense of drugs are bad, even though they consumed alcohol and caffeine
Which
and
is worse.
tobacco. Exactly. But they didn't use drugs. And in the sense that different classes of drugs have different risks or potential benefits, and that the class of drugs that we call psychedelics, or plants that are included in that, were generally all lumped together under the illicit drug category without much distinction from other kinds of illicit drugs. And so I think that was a sort of big one to overcome, is that the classical psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca are not like other drugs that cause, for example, chronic dependent patterns of use. Psychedelics typically don't present in that way for people. Not to say they don't have potential risks, but addiction isn't one of them.
Interesting.
That is interesting. I didn't realize that.
I have heard that, but I was curious if that really is the case, and it's good to know, right? So that kind of eliminates that maybe concern that it could become addictive. Obviously, like you said, there could be other side effects, but from what I've heard, and again, I'm not a doctor, just from what I heard, most people I know who have done it have had very positive experience afterwards and have really helped themselves. Let's say you're stuck or you're just in a place where you're not moving forward, it has really helped them get to the next level of creativity for a lot of people that I know who've done it.
Well, that was my original research impetus. It was actually not in the clinical or therapeutic uses of these substances. It was looking at I came across the metaphor of plant teacher. I use the word metaphor in quotation marks, because in indigenous cultures, for example, in the Amazon, or that use peyote or psilocybin, I found common in the anthropological literature, common reports about these being understood as teachers, and that people who partook of them could learn from the spirits of these plants. And I was struck by that also because I knew in the 1960s there was claims of things like cognitive enhancement and creativity. I was a Beatles fan, and I knew that their musical output changed significantly after they started experimenting with LSD. I read Aldous Huxley's book Island when I was 16, and that was his final novel that he wrote before he died. And he describes in that a fictional psychedelic type mushroom that's used for different kinds of purposes in a sort of utopian society, and one of them is educational, and talks about the rite of passage, or people transitioning from youth to adulthood having a psychedelic experience that can facilitate experiences of like wonder and awe and attention to oneself and one's relationship with the world. And that really resonated and struck with me. So led me to pursue first a master's thesis and then a PhD in education, developing this idea. At the time, the word psychedelic was kind of taboo.
Right.
There's not much psychedelic research happening.
Sort of, yeah. It still has a negative connotation at times.
So I went with the word entheogen that had been coined by some religious studies scholars and anthropologists, that describes the shamanic or spiritual type practices of plants like ayahuasca or peyote, and developed the idea of entheogenic education, which was kind of code for using psychedelics as tools for learning or cognition. Because again, by the time I was able to start talking about entheogenic education, I was, a little ways down the road before they realized what I was actually talking about. And by then I'd kind of gotten their attention and was able to continue. So that led to some publications, and felt, lucky to be able to participate in a wave of renewal of interest, legitimate interest academically and scientifically into psychedelics, and then ultimately medically and therapeutically. So that kind of came later. My initial understanding of these things was as tools for, I describe them as cognitive tools for learning.
I have to ask, obviously we're not going to talk about you and wealth so much, but My question's more about the economic impact, right? This is a growing industry. It's a burgeoning psychedelic industry. And I wonder, has it had contributing natures to local and global economies? Or, when people think about drugs, we think about the pitfalls of commercialization, right? We think of with weed, for example. If I think about weed, sadly, I think about going to the US, and in certain states, all I can smell is weed, namely Vegas and parts of Hollywood.
New York.
And yet at the same time, I thought it would bring all this business to certain places, but it hasn't. It's again created some sort of lack of scale, or fair scale, should I say, or fair balance. Do you see an economic impact that has occurred to local and global economies through the psychedelic industry?
There's so many different directions to take that question. I'll start with ayahuasca. Absolutely, there's been economic impacts in the local communities from which it came in the Amazon region. In sometimes, it's sort of dualistic ways, positive and negative. There's been sort of revival of interest among indigenous peoples whose traditions these are to continue learning. Young people who maybe wouldn't have followed their grandparents' traditions because they want to get a cell phone and move to the city, realize that there's actually a future in terms of providing these kinds of ceremonial practices, but largely again for well-heeled Westerners or folks coming from the global north. So that's where the downside is, and the sort of influx of US dollars or euros into the communities with maybe not so much distribution as they were used to in a more egalitarian economic system, perhaps historically. So that's one facet to that. There was certainly a boom about 5 years ago, sort of venture capitalist inflows to try to commercialize psychedelics that haven't, I think, panned out for many of those enterprises. There's still some, big clinical trials that are going on with some of them, and we'll see where they go with respect to entering the sort of pharmaceutical industry, which is the sort of path for legitimacy in the health systems of places like Canada and the US and European countries. In terms of the sort of general sense of sort of drugs and ways to sort of profit from them or make them economical, typically rests on the idea that what I call the 80-20 rule, that 80% of the revenues are derived from 20% of the hardcore, regular, habitual, daily users, which is true with a whole vast variety of different substances: alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, probably heroin, cocaine, or a list of drugs. But again, psychedelics don't lead to that chronic daily pattern of consumption in a way that's going to be easily monetized for people. Often, microdoses could be considered an exception, but those are very small amounts, and even that's a regime that's maybe only 3 or 4 days a week. It's not like people take large quantities morning, noon, and night in the way that they can do with other substances. Caffeine's probably the best example, right?
So on the topic of wealth and medicinals, I actually drink a coffee that claims to have medicinal mushroom, which is reishi and lion's mane. So what do you think about all these products being sold? I don't want to say claiming to have.
Good question.
I'm always just curious, like, is it really in here? Is it helping me think better and focus? I know those mushrooms are condoned to do those things, but now that we're finding it in coffee, they have it in chocolate, they have it in, they're integrating it in a lot of different everyday substances. So I'm curious, is it actually working?
Difficult to separate the scientific evidence from the commercial hype, I would say. I think there's, and this is not my area of expertise, but I believe there is some evidence and ongoing research to show the potential health benefits of non-psychoactive mushrooms, the varieties that you mentioned. But there's certainly probably a lot more commercial hype going on with folks getting ahead of the science and putting a label on something, which may or may not be accurate. And that speaks to the kind of potential regulatory areas of natural health products, and not necessarily, being held to account for the kinds of quality controls that we assume in other types of consumer products.
Alicia brings on a good point, right? Which is this inverted commas idea of valuation of health, right? That the psychedelics challenge traditional notions of medical treatments. How do we put a value on this type of healing that they offer? And does that align with current healthcare models that exist now?
Great question. I wrote a paper or a chapter in a book called The Economics of Ayahuasca that was looking at exactly that question. And I mean, my own personal conclusion is I don't think you can quantify the kinds of insights that you get from these experiences, or the kinds of health benefits. Those are immeasurable. And, there's lots of very, very wealthy people who wish they could trade all their wealth for better health because they've got, they're going the wrong direction in that regard. So that's, I think a really deep question that probably would take us all afternoon to be able to unpack more fully. But I would come back to, how do you quantify or measure the value? And the commercialization of healthcare is a challenging area to consider. But these kinds of experiences, as I say, can be really valuable for people to reconsider the kinds of steps that don't necessarily cost a lot of money. In fact, can even save you money if it involves, reducing consumption of things, or sort of lifestyle behaviors that come down to some of the basics, the insights around, eat right, exercise, get lots of sleep, add some meditation, maybe some yoga. These things can all be done relatively inexpensively and, create huge value in terms of your long-term health span.
And yet a lot of people don't do it.
I mean, I, for one, am petrified. And I have CPTSD, and I've been told by a few people, including neuroscientists, therapists, there's great research that shows MDMA can be very beneficial to people with my form of CPTSD. But I'm still way too scared to even think about testing the concept.
Yeah, again, these kinds of substances are powerful tools, and you want to do your homework. Don't enter into it sort of blithely, or consider all of the different kinds of factors that you'd want to take into account in terms of when to make that decision, how to make that decision, with whom to make that decision. So that's just my general advice.
One of the things you mentioned right in the beginning of this conversation is this beautiful word of awe. And when I was reading through a lot of your material, you mentioned, the ability to evoke awe, that this is one of the things that psychedelics do. How does this state of mind contribute to personal and collective transformation?
So I'd say these are things that psychedelics can do. I wouldn't say they necessarily always do, but under optimal conditions, a sense of rekindling, a newness that you see around you in the world, that we kind of get jaded in our adult life and sort of alienated from the raw inputs that we had as children. Young children are full of wonder and awe. I joke about our schooling system. Kids enter kindergarten full of wonder and curiosity, and by the time they finish high school, if they have any of that left, it's usually despite their schooling, not because of it. And that's where, again, a kind of rite of passage type experiential education involving these kinds of plants or substances could really help people find a sense of meaning or purpose that can be really transformational in terms of a rich life. Rich doesn't have to be defined in money terms. That would probably be a takeaway for your listeners.
And it's funny, I was praying to the she that runs the world that you would say that. In a previous episode for our listeners, you'll hear me talking to Ollie the chocolatier about this concept of rich and how so many people immediately take it to $1, a pound, a euro, a baht, a rupee, a cluny, a rand. versus realizing the true richness of life and what truly are the ingredients of a rich life have very little to do with a currency.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
I love that. And I think you said something interesting as well. It's sort of getting back to what we talked about earlier today on a previous podcast, getting back to play. Like as a child, when you're in kindergarten, what do? You play all day. And then you're right. By the time you get out of high school, you don't even know what that is anymore. And I think that could be part of where this journey takes you, is back to just, that time that maybe you've forgotten about. And where it can lead is the journey that I'm excited to take when and if I do it, which I'm getting more brave as I continue to have this conversation.
I love that. Me too. Funny you should say that. That could
Mm-hmm.
be a Rich Life Recipe retreat. We could take us plus a couple of our listeners and go and experience this for ourselves.
I think we should.
I'll give you another example from my own life, which
Please.
was an experience I had as a teenager with a friend of mine who was the guitar player in our class. He played guitar. I had a guitar. My dad had a guitar at home that I kind of learned a few chords on, but never really played, never practiced. And then my friend and I had an experience one evening under the influence of these kinds of substances, and he was playing an electric guitar, so his fingers were moving over here, and the sound was coming out of the amplifier over there. So it was a bit of kind of a synesthesia type thing going on. And I remember I was completely mesmerized and just sat there thinking, I want to do that. I want to be able to do that too. And this light bulb went on in my head, and I went home the next day and pulled my dad's guitar out of the closet and started to practice the few chords that I could remember, and basically became a musician. I mean, not immediately, but I went on and played. I got into bands. I studied West African percussion and guitar, went to Guinea and studied there, got into an Afrofusion dance band. Huge sort of rich part of my life is music, and couldn't imagine not having that dimension, the sort of creative outlet that I see coming all from that single experience. That I feel like if I don't know, maybe if I hadn't had that experience, I would have found my way into doing it, but I don't think so. I think there was something that happened for me in that sort of moment of like just being inspired to like want to do that.
I just think something clicks. It's like the mind-body connection that maybe we're all missing, because we're just not, it's not all connecting together at one time. That's such an amazing story. I've tried to learn the guitar and I gave up 4 times because I couldn't do it. So maybe that'll click for me too.
There's you talk about artistic, and actually one of my questions was exactly this. You're a musician, and I wanted to know how your creativity, how it intersected with psychedelics, which you've explained. But does it also connect to your research on psychedelics?
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of a trite phrase, but I joke that my research topic chose me. I didn't choose it. So in terms of my PhD studies, I entered into the PhD program initially interested in doing something on just drug education. What do we teach young people about drugs in schools? And for the first few years of my program, started doing research on that. I actually published a few academic papers on that topic, but it was in an ayahuasca ceremony one night that I had this sort of download of, no, you're going to do your dissertation on ayahuasca and entheogenic education. So I pivoted, I changed my supervisor, and ended up putting together a thesis committee or dissertation committee that allowed me to pursue that.
That's incredible.
So sort of creative inspiration for my academic research was certainly catalyzed by these kinds of experiences as well.
So it sounds like you have had positive personal experiences with everything, or the majority of the things that you've tried. Would you say they've been positive?
I'd say there's been some negatives as well, or I mean, not long-term, fortunately for me, but certainly some really hard, difficult challenging lessons and insights that I won't go into here, but it's by no means, and this was such hard learning for me, about understanding ayahuasca in particular, the idea of, the hippie culture of the 1960s, pink elephants and fluffy bunnies, is not where ayahuasca comes from. It's, a long history of use in what is known as occult sorcery, black magic, dark magic, and ayahuasca in its traditional contexts throughout the Amazon can be seen as a force for both good and for harm.
Wow.
Not unlike the analogy of like nuclear energy. You can use nuclear energy for making bombs, or you can use it for nuclear medicine. So there's a sense, again, in the indigenous traditions, that this is really powerful stuff, and it's not necessarily light. It can be dark, and so there's a lot of, I think, caution and understanding that people need to be applying to their pursuits in this area, in terms of recognizing that we're just sort of trying to learn. Part of my whole enterprise in my research was flipping on its head the colonial assumption that indigenous peoples had everything sort of wrong and backward, and that white Europeans were going to come in and help them sort it out. I thought perhaps we need to flip that on its head and respect that indigenous peoples had things sorted out, and we should be learning from them. And probably in a whole number of domains, ecology and economy, but certainly in the area of psychoactive plant use, the real experts aren't in universities like myself. They're the practitioners who are following their ancestors' traditions for centuries.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I think many of our listeners are interested in cultivating wisdom in their own lives. So what are some practical steps or daily practices that you would suggest for people looking to deepen their understanding, with the world around them, or maybe interested in learning more about everything we talked about today? What are some of the practical steps or practices that you do on the daily?
Well, one that's actually kind of new for me is meditation. I just in the last 6 months took up transcendental meditation, which I'd long heard about and thought, that'd probably be a good thing to do. Finally went and did the training, and have kept up a regular practice, and already feeling like I'm seeing benefits from that. So that's kind of a new thing that I think is helpful, and certainly say the science, I think, is there as well. I'm also a fan of reading. I love books, and I feel like that's something that I even myself find we're kind of losing touch with good old-fashioned paper, and so many screens in our, and ways of getting information and knowledge that don't involve that old-fashioned modality. But I still like it. Being out in nature, getting out into some kind of natural environment, if you have the luxury or opportunity to do that in some kind of regular way. For me, it's often walking my dog in the park or down by the beach. That's recharging and energizing. My family, my wife and stepdaughters, being around them is cultivating a sense of wisdom in myself in terms of parenting, and recognizing shortcomings or blind spots that for myself have come through that kind of family dynamic.
I love that. Can I ask, obviously you're involved, you do, I assume, supplementation. Do you give your pets any supplementation, your dog?
No, he's on a raw meat diet, so I don't know if that counts, but no.
So he's on a Pets Whole Foods, is that your?
It's like a raw food.
Raw food
versus
wow.
Kibble in a bag. It was advised when we got him as a puppy, and so we sort of follow that. I think there's some controversy in the veterinary world about the risks around that, and
depending on the belly, the environment, the gene, the dog, there's product. A bunch of things.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
Correct.
So I'm no expert in that area, other than and I was a very reluctant dog owner. That's another whole story. Is I originally said no dog. I don't want a dog,
and you have a dog.
And the dog bonded to me, and I bonded to the dog. It's everybody's.
That's what happens.
Yeah,
that's beautiful. That's my goal. I've only got one more question. So, Alicia, if you've got anything after mine, but my question's about legacy. What do you hope will be your lasting contribution? to the field of psychedelic research?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to think that my work has contributed to others being inspired to follow either personally or academically or professionally some kind of deeper learning or understanding in this, as you just started off saying, the misunderstood area of human experience. And that I say my original contribution wasn't thinking so much about the therapeutic applications, but about the potential educational ones, and that I think has still yet to be more fully developed, and hope to see more work go on in this area. That it's not necessarily people who have a diagnosed illness who can benefit from these substances, but perhaps a broader set of people, and perhaps the general public writ large. There's certainly a lot of issues facing us humans in the world today, and some tools like these might be helpful in trying to shift understandings in ways that can help solve those issues.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for taking the time to explain to us these things and to talk about it in such a, you have a real, and I know this because you and I spoke about podcasting before we've done a call. And when I asked you about the subject you were thinking about talking about, and you have such a grace about your subject matter. You speak of it in such a compassionate way and so nuanced that it was something that I knew that I wanted to get you on the show, and I wanted other people to hear the way you speak, because there's also a reverence and respect that is beautiful to witness. So thank you for allowing our listeners and those that watch us on YouTube and wherever you find your great audio and visual content a chance to witness that.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
I just loved everything that I've learned here today. It makes me want to do a deeper dive and learn. So I'd love to read some of your papers and look into that a bit more. I know you've spent a lot of time doing your own research, and I'd like to know, where do you think, and I think you answered this a little bit in what you just said, but I'm hoping to see this integrated in the average daily use of medical treatment. Do you think the way things are hopefully changing, that doctors today, would be interested in integrating some of this into their regimes of, in addition to just prescribing a drug, would they, since the research is getting more and more prominent, would they be willing to suggest some of these alternative medicinal ways?
I think there's already been a huge transformation in this sort of medical field and health field more generally over the past couple of decades since I began, this research. When I was told in graduate school at the start, this is career suicide. Why would anybody look at these things? We know that they're dangerous and bad, and case closed. But really, in the last 10, 15 years, since some of the early clinical trials, the Hopkins group and the UK Imperial College London group started publishing some of the early clinical trials, and obviously so much more since then. I've seen just a general respectability and, in fact, excitement, especially among clinicians who are recognizing the limitations of the tools that they currently have available to treat mental illness or addictions, and really wanting to have other possibilities available for their patients. And I don't want to get ahead of the science. There's a whole regulatory apparatus for clinical trials and regulatory approvals. But if the science as it's currently being done continues, I have no doubt that we'll probably see that come to fruition sometime in the next 5-10 years, and create a further advancement. And of course, there's in the United States, in a few states, Colorado, Oregon, there's been movement through ballot initiatives. So stay tuned. I think there'll be more to come on this for sure.
I think so too. I'm excited for that. Sorry, Jason.
No. I 100% agree. Dr. Kenneth, where can people find more about you? Where can they learn more about the work that you're doing? Where can we drive our audience?
Yeah, I haven't been so active on social media, but I have a personal homepage, drkennethtupper.com. So people can go there and find most of my published work is available for download there. And I'll try to get more active on some of the platforms. I signed up for accounts, but find myself too busy to be routinely using them.
Nothing wrong with that. I know that's where I learned so much about you. For our listeners, for those viewers who are watching us, thank you so much for your time. We truly appreciate it. We will keep bringing you people who add to a rich life, who redefine what it is to have a rich life and give you the ingredients so that you can have the richest life possible. I've been Jason Allen Scott. My co-hostess with the mostess has been
Alicia Shiro.
Our guest has been Dr. Kenneth Tupper, and this has been The Rich Life Recipe.
If you love this episode, make sure to subscribe so you never miss your weekly fix. New episodes are released every Wednesday, and if you think this podcast could help someone in your life build their own rich life recipe, please make sure to share this with them too.
Hey, you. Yes, you. I'd like to invite you to something brand new, something we're calling One Person Empires. Who am I? Jason Allen Scott. You just saw me a couple of seconds ago in that podcast, where we were telling you about a rich life, where we bring you guests to explain how to have a rich life. It's in this idea that we decided to create a community to teach people just like you how to have your own rich life. What is a rich life? It's about doing what you want, with whom you want, when you want, wherever you want. Think of one-person empires like the Alcoholics Anonymous, a place to come to find community, to find people just like you who've done it, who've got through it, who can help you get through it. Because no one is coming to save you. That's what it says. Save yourself. Build an empire. That's what I want for you. That's what your family wants for you. That's what your community wants for you. AI, robotics, technology, tariffs, it's changing the world. But here's a chance to you to change your own world, to find sovereignty, find independence. This is what we're offering. It's a set of principles and a set of challenges to turn you from entrepreneur to entrepreneur. It's a blueprint we can teach absolutely anyone. And that's what's inside One Person Empires. Other people just like you, learning the process, going through the challenges. In fact, I wanted to make it so bulletproof that in our very first challenge, I'm going to show you how to make all your money back for joining. And because you're a listener of the podcast, we've made you a special offer. Simply type in listener to get a discount in the community. Joining the community, have a chance to find out what it's like to live a rich life.